Hey, this is Jamie from Stonemaier Games, and today I'm going to talk about my top 10 favorite Evergreen games. Now, an Evergreen game is fairly subjective as to what it is, and I'm limited in terms of the data I have to determine exactly what games should be eligible for this category. But I recently wrote a blog post about this topic, and I looked back over some data provided by a website called ICV2, and you'll find a link to this blog post and links to these articles in the description below. And ICV2 collects sales data from the Hobby Games channel, so Hobby Games stores around the world. I think they include some online game stores. I'm not exactly sure. I looked at data that for games that have appeared on their top 10 list over the last 2018 through 2021. So over the course of 4 years, that should be 8 total reports because they report that twice a year. I also included one online game store, Game Nerdz, reported their top 10 sellers in 2021. So I included that. So any games that appeared at least 3 times, that to me is an evergreen game, a game that is continually selling well from year to year, or from period to period, region to region. Again, subjective analysis there, just some way of determining what an evergreen game is. And I know for sure that there are some games that sell really well that are not on this list because maybe they don't sell primarily through retailers. Maybe they just didn't quite make the top 10. For example, our game Viticulture, I consider an evergreen game. We continually print it, we continually sell it. We've sold over 200,000 copies worldwide. That to me is an evergreen game, especially after being in print for 10 years. But that isn't on the list. That doesn't appear on any of the top 10 lists from ICV2. So, with that introduction said, let's jump in and mention a few games that on this list that are great games. I mean, all these games are incredible games if they've sold this well over multiple periods of time. But these didn't quite make my top 10. They are Catan, Pandemic, Gloomhaven, Exploding Kittens, Betrayal at House on the Hill, Unmatched, Superfight, Dominion, and Marvel Champions LCG. There are 2 Stonemaier games that did make these lists at least 3 times. One of them is our game Wingspan, designed by Elizabeth Hargrave. And the thing I'm going to talk about today for the top 10 games, I didn't include the Stonemaier games on this list, but the top 10 games and these games is why I think they are evergreen games. There are a few trends, some patterns, I think, that are explain why these are evergreen games. So they continue to sell year after year. I think part of the reason for a few of these games is that Wingspan is really highly rated on BoardGameGeek. I think highly rated games not only are an indicator of how much fun people have out of playing those games, but also if people are looking to get into the hobby or they're looking for which game to buy next, one way to do that is to look at the BGG top 10 list or the top 20 list or the top 100 list and look at games there that might appeal to you. I think that's part of it for Wingspan and a couple other games that I'll mention here. Wingspan includes a solo mode and really good 2-player play. I guess part of that is subjective. I am definitely biased in talking about Wingspan, but I think a lot of the games on this list include solo play and 2-player play that adds to the accessibility, even though these games also go up to, Wingspan goes up to 5 players. The other game I'll mention in a second also goes up to 5 players. The price point, I think, is applicable for Wingspan. I think having a good price helps make a game evergreen. Wingspan retails around $60. That can depend based on your exact region. But when I was looking at this list, many of the games on the list are around $40 to $50. So this is a little bit more expensive than many of those games. But this is crucially different than many of the really, really expensive games that you might see on Kickstarter. And even one that I'll mention in a second. I think those are the anomalies when it comes to evergreen games. I'll talk about that more in a second. And also, the aesthetic of Wingspan, I think, is inviting, and yet the mechanisms of the game are inviting, and the ease of learning the game, ease of playing the game, that's inviting to both gamers and non-gamers alike. Those are the few of the reasons why I think Wingspan is an evergreen game. The other Stonemaier game that has appeared on these lists a bunch of times is Scythe. And Scythe is a bit of an anomaly for this list. I think Scythe is very unique for the artwork in particular, the world building that Jakob Brzezowski created. But Scythe has a higher price point than many of the games on this list. It has a $90 price point. And that's more in the kind of the expensive deluxe Kickstarter game realm of pricing. And this is a key distinction that I want to make in this video. You can make, in fact, I would not recommend that you take anything I say in this video and say, okay, I need to do these exact things. And if I do, I'll have an evergreen game. There are many other factors that go into these games kind of breaking through, especially with as many games as are designed these days. But I think one key distinction that you might want to make, or might want to think about at least, is do I want a game that is a big hit on, say, Kickstarter or GameFound? A big box game like Scythe, a big box game like this has miniatures, it has a ton of stuff in the box, it's expensive. But if you do that, you are probably significantly limiting and decreasing the chances that it will be an Evergreen hit, because Evergreen games are usually a little bit smaller and cost a lot less than many of those deluxe games on Kickstarter. So that's a key choice I think you want to make. Do you want to go after that big hit up front, or the ongoing annual bestseller year after year? It's your choice there. Scythe, I think many of the games on this list are theme-first games, and Scythe is very, very much a theme-first game. Jakob had started to build this world, and I kind of jumped in there and said, hey, can I design a game in that world? I love what you're doing. And every time I made a design decision, it was based off the world building and the art that Jakob had worked on. And also, even Scythe, which is a fairly complex game, it has a much longer rulebook than many of the games on this list. I included a quick start card for each player, and the player mats kind of show you everything that you can do in the game. And so your first few turns of the game that get you into the game are very easy. Everything is there in the user interface of the game. That's something I talked about recently in my heavy games list, that they might have a lot of complex decisions and branching paths and whatnot, but the core things that you can do on your turn are very simple and explained in the user interface of the game. I think Scythe does that really well. All right, so those are the two games from Stonemaier Games. Let me jump into my top 10 now. At number 10 is Century. Century has a few different editions. I've just noted Century here. I don't know exactly which editions have sold well, or if maybe ICV2 has included all Century games in this category of Century games. But there's Century Spice Road, there's Century, I think, A New World, there's Century Golem Edition. I have played a few of these. I think the most memorable version of it to me is the original Century A Spice Road, which has some great mechanisms in it. You can watch my video about that. This video isn't exactly about mechanisms. It's more about why Century, I think, is an Evergreen game. I think it hits the aesthetics. The aesthetics of the game are beautiful, and even some of the components have great table presence. I think they include metal coins in the core game. The price point is very reasonable for Century. And Century, let's see what it does play for player count. I'm looking at my other screen for the blog post, which you can definitely refer to. Century minimum player count is 2, which I think is pretty important. There's only there are 3 games on this entire list, not even my top 10 list, but all of these Evergreen games. There are only 3 games that start at 3 players. Every other game goes down to 1 or 2 players, and I think that is really, really important for a game to have Evergreen potential. And Century definitely does that. And also just the playing time and wait. I think Century hits that nice sweet spot of around 45 minutes, maybe an hour at most, and it's really easy to get into and start playing the game. It's a kind of a quintessential Evergreen game, Century, especially Century of Spice Road, or the Spice Road. So that's number 10. And number 9 is Marvel Legendary. Now you might think that a lot of the games on this list, on the overall Evergreen list, have intellectual properties, big intellectual properties like Marvel and Star Wars and things like that. Only a few of them do, actually, though. And 2 of them are Marvel. Marvel Legendary and Marvel Champions are on the overall list here. Which I thought was interesting to note that intellectual properties aren't necessarily a driving force for some of these huge ongoing best-selling games. But Marvel Legendary, I think, is, in general, it fits a lot of these categories. The price point, the weight of the game, it's one of the few cooperative games on the list, which I don't think is an indicator of whether or not a game could be Evergreen or not. Even though there are more competitive games on this list, I don't think that is. I don't think that's a pattern worth paying too much attention to. That's just my hunch. I have no real data to support that, but I think it just so happens that there aren't as many cooperative games on this list. Sorry, I see my lighting behind me is doing weird things. I don't know why. I hope that's not too distracting for you, but hopefully you can just listen while I talk instead. But yeah, Marvel Legendary, I think, is a really solid game. I definitely feel like a superhero on a team of superheroes when I'm playing the game, and the Marvel IP really adds to it. To me, it's a theme-first game, even though it has some core kind of traditional deck-building mechanisms to it. The only category where I think it's a little iffy is ease of setup. I think Marvel Legendary is not known for its ease of setup, even though its ease of teaching and learning are pretty it's a low bar. Also, aesthetically, I think it's a beautiful game. So I think for all those reasons, it is an Evergreen game that I really enjoy. And number 8 is Boss Monster. Boss Monster, I think, is the only game on this list, that has the kind of a pixelated art style, and I think that element of nostalgia really helped it become an evergreen best-selling game. Boss Monster, I believe, started out on Kickstarter. I think I backed the original Kickstarter. I played the game. I really do enjoy the game of Boss Monster. I haven't played it in a while, but I love the idea of it. You are running a dungeon essentially, and you are trying to lure adventurers to your dungeon and then destroy them essentially once they get to your dungeon, which is a fun twist on a theme. I really like that little twist. And so I think the aesthetics of Boss Monster are really, really cute. The price point is definitely very low. It's a small box. It's just cards. It doesn't take up a lot of space. And the playing time and weight are very reasonable. And like some of the games on this list that I think are interesting, it has some somewhat chaotic elements. Like, this isn't a huge, big engine building epic 2-hour game. It's a fairly light game with some chaotic elements to it, and I think that actually works for many of these evergreen games. Even though Boss Monster isn't going to appear on the top 100 list of Board Game Geek, that's okay. That's not one of the requirements, I think, to become an evergreen game. That's Boss Monster at number 8. At number 7 is Root. Root defies some of the things on this list. Like, Root's playing time is quite long. Root's learning curve is fairly big, although I do think the user interface of those player mats in Root, a highly asymmetric game that explains the asymmetry of your specific faction, are really, really good. The aesthetics of Root are excellent. I love the art. I believe Kyle Farron is the artist of Root and some of the other leader games. And so I think that the theme of it, the aesthetics of it, and the uniqueness of Root, how asymmetric every faction is, really, really helps. But unlike its predecessor, Vast, I think Root is definitely easier to get into, easier to teach and learn, even though there's still a learning curve. And I think part of that has to do with something that I always mention when I talk about Root, which is that all players, most factions share the same victory condition. You're getting points for the most part. You're trying to get to 30 victory points. But how you do that is vastly different from one faction to the next. So to have that connecting thread is really, really helpful and helps that learning curve compared to Vast. Although Vast is still a really ambitious, interesting game. So I think it's interesting to see such a strongly asymmetric game on this list through Root, but I think Root just offers so much replayability. I'm guessing it's one of these word of mouth evergreen games where you play Root and you're like, okay, I want to play this a bunch of times with different factions, and so I want to get this game. And also, I think they kept the price point very low. They kept the box tight and the price point low, which I think was really clever. Let me see if it does. Look at my list over here to see if it does play solo. It does not play solo, but it does play 2-player. That's Root at number 7. At number 6, we have the first game that I own on this list, and that is Coup. Coup, as you can see, is a very small box. It's a very inexpensive game. I think it may be around $15, maybe $20 at most. And it's short. It plays from 2 to 6 players. It plays in about 15 minutes. I've seen games go up to 30 minutes, but it's a shorter game. I think those things play into the evergreen nature of Coup. And this is just a nice little game that you can, it doesn't take up a lot of table space. You can toss it down on the table. You can easily teach it in a few minutes to players. It's very, very easy to get to the table. And you can get to the table often because it's essentially a filler game. You can get to the table after or before a longer game. And it's one of those games that I think is also a great gift game because it's so small and inexpensive. If you know someone who likes games, I think someone might default to a game like this. And yeah, I think all those factors and some others go into making Coup an evergreen game. Somewhat similar to Coup is my number 5 game, and that is Codenames. Not necessarily the Deep Undercover edition, even though this is the edition that we have, but Codenames has been on this list, has appeared on ICV2's list a ton of times. In fact, more times than any other game on this list. It's appeared 8 times in these lists over the last 8 years. So I think that's actually every single time the ICV2 list has appeared, Codenames has been on it. Codenames, I think, is just super, super accessible. It's a little, I guess the teach is a little weird, but once you get it, it clicks and it doesn't take long to play. It's a very reasonable price. I think it's around $20 at most, smaller box game. And it doesn't even, like the aesthetic of it, I guess, varies from edition to edition. The aesthetic of Codenames is not a big part of the game. So this is kind of an anomaly in many of these games that the aesthetic doesn't play a big role in it. I think it's more about the price, the accessibility, how easy it is to pull people into games of Codenames. And it's just, yeah, it's been a huge hit for Czech Games Edition. That's Codenames at number 5. And number 4 is one of the games that I think of when I think of modern classics and the games that have been Evergreen games for a long time now, and that is Ticket to Ride. Surprisingly, I don't own Ticket to Ride, but it is one of those modern classics that I really do love to return to time after time. The route building aspects of it, how there is great tension between players, but not too much competition between players. I love Ticket to Ride, and I think the digital implementations have also accented and complemented the tabletop versions really, really well. The sales have overlapped, I think, between the two. It's one of the best games to do that, in my opinion. It has a great price point. It looks great on the table. It's very easy to learn and teach and set up and play and remember how to play if you want to get it back to the table. It doesn't have a solo mode, but I believe it does play 2-player. Yeah, it plays 2-player. It plays up to 5 players. I think that's nice for many of these games. Only play up to 4 players, but it's really nice. In fact, there are more games than I would think that play more than that, up to 5 or 6. But I think hitting that 2 to 4 player range is nice. That's kind of the standard sweet spot. But if you can also go down to 1 and then up to 5, I think you definitely increase the range of the game, especially if doing so doesn't increase the price point all that much. And I think Ticket to Ride definitely does that. Ticket to Ride, just a game I really enjoy. It broke through. I guess one of the things to ask about this list is if Ticket to Ride came out for the first time today, would it end up being an evergreen game? And it's hard to say. I don't know because there's so many games on the market today. But some of these, I think, are due to timing. Codenames came out at a really crucial time or just worked. If Codenames had come out during the pandemic, would it have worked as well? I don't know. Ticket to Ride came out at a time where we were still moving into the modern era of gaming. And I think it just hit at the right time. The next game on the list kind of finds that sweet spot too in terms of timing, and that is Azul. Very few games on this list are abstract games. Azul is a beautiful game, but it is an abstract game. And it came along at the right time, I think, where there wasn't an abstract game that really hit this nice sweet spot. You can learn the game just by even looking at the back of the box. The rules are that simple to it. And the pieces feel great in Azul. The box isn't too big. The price point is right. And it doesn't have solo mode, but it does play 2-player. It's not too heavy. I mean, it's like kind of like Century. It's like this game was designed to be an evergreen game, except that it wasn't a theme-first game. That is the one maybe exception for all the different things on this list that you see among these other games. Azul, awesome game. And that is my number 3 game on this list. And I am showing you the Summer Pavilion version of it. This is my favorite edition of Azul, but they're definitely, I think that probably the best-selling version of it is the original Azul. This is the one that I recommend if someone wants to get into the game, though. At number 2 on the list is a game I don't own, but I do truly, truly love that, and that is The Quacks of Quedlinburg. And I was almost a little surprised to see this on the list, as delighted as I am by Quacks. It's been one of my favorite games for quite some time now. It is super accessible. It is really easy to get people into a game of Quacks, and the fun of pulling into the bag and pulling out those ingredients to create your potion, your brew is great. It feels great. But I don't know, for some reason it feels a little bit odd on this list, but maybe it shouldn't. I mean, it's won some awards. It's the right price point. The art is kind of kooky and fun and silly and joyful. And it seems like a theme-first design. I don't know if it actually was, but the theme is very well integrated into the game itself. It's not too heavy. It doesn't outstay its welcome. It kind of hits a lot of these sweet spots of an evergreen game. I'm glad it's an evergreen game. I don't know why I'm doubting it at all, but it really does hit a lot of those sweet spots. And maybe part of it is that it hits that familiar thing that a lot of gamers now, thanks to Dominion, which is on the overall list, a lot of gamers know, and people in general, I think, know what a deck building game is, know the basics of it, and to see a little twist on that in a bag building game like Quacks of Quedlinburg, maybe that resonated with a lot of people. Definitely resonates with me. I love the game. It's at number 2 on this list. At number 1, we do have another game with an intellectual property on it. I don't know how much that played into the game's success. I think it's just a really, really well-designed game, and that is Dune Imperium. This is, I would say, one of the heavier and longer games on this list, but it has been selling really, really well over the last couple of years. It's also one of the newer games that's appeared on these top 10 selling lists. But I think it has emerged as an evergreen game, based on my formula, at least. Price point is still nice, even though there's a lot of stuff in the box. Price point is reasonable. And I think that helps for the evergreen nature of it. It does have a solo mode. That probably helps. Plays well with 2 players, plays up to 4 players. The art, I think, is pretty solid, especially for an intellectual property where they didn't use screenshots, but they created art based on the characters that were going to appear in the movie, or that did appear in the movie. But it is an intellectual property game. But I don't think anyone doubted that a game from Clank designer Paul Dennen, was going to have a really strong theme, but also really, really strong mechanisms to it. But yeah, I don't know. I love you. If you watch this channel, you know how much I love Dune Imperium. It's a wonderful deck building / worker placement game. And so I think part of the reason this is pushed onto these evergreen lists is that it's been really, really well received by people, by gamers. And I keep saying the word gamers, but I think a lot of these games are welcoming to non-gamers too. They might be embraced by gamers, but they are the types of games that avid gamers are happy to show to people who are not yet avid gamers. And Dune Imperium, I don't know if that's exactly something I should say about this game, but this is a game where if I knew someone who wasn't an avid gamer but loved Dune, I would love to show them how this game works. Even though it might be a little bit over their head, I'd still love to show them how it works. And so maybe that's one of the reasons that Dune Imperium has broken through and appeared on so many top sales lists over the last couple of years. One thing I should mention before I go is that you might notice that none of the games on this list, at least in the core games, have campaigns. I have another video about my top 10 favorite campaign games and talking about campaign games. I have an article about campaign games. But I think campaign games are one of those things that work really well for crowdfunding. They get people excited about this massive adventure to go on. But I don't think they work as well for evergreen games. I think evergreen games are better off if they are just, one and done replayable games over and over again, ideally within like a 45 to 60 minute time frame. There are exceptions to that, like Scythe and Dune, and even Wingspan can go well over an hour at higher player counts. But I think that's something to keep in mind, that if you're looking to design a campaign game, you're almost designing for crowdfunding rather than for it to be an evergreen game. There are exceptions to it. Gloomhaven is the big exception to all the rules on all the lists. But yeah, that's something to keep in mind, I think. I'd love to hear your thoughts about why you think these games, or any of the games that I mentioned today, are evergreen games, and some of any of your thoughts that you have about evergreen games in general. What you think about maybe when you're designing a game, when you're looking at a game, what you think are the things that will increase the chances of a game being well received, bringing people joy, and selling well year after year. I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Thanks.